Our next section of the game is called the endgame. In the endgame, it's at the end of the game, so that means that usually there's not that many pieces on the board. In fact, we can define an endgame if we count all the pieces and their value is under 15 points. So for example, in this position, white only has 3 points. Remember that we don't count the pawn as a piece. So white only has 3 points, and black has no points. So definitely here, it's an endgame. Now before we get into some specific endgame examples, I want to go over some special guidelines that the endgame has. So first, in the endgame, if you're up material, try to hold onto your pawns. Because the endgame has a huge probability for the pawn to promote, especially when there's not that many pieces, pawns are actually more valuable and sometimes can help win the game where other pieces can't. For example, in this position right now, if it was any side to move, white or black, the position is a draw. However, if white instead had a pawn on g6, so let's take a look at this position would instead be a win no matter who it is to play. Even though the bishop is worth 3 points and the pawn is only worth 1, this position is better for white than the previous one. Since pawns are so helpful in winning, if you're down material, then you should also trade pawns. If you trade pawns, then it reduces the opponent's chance to promote a pawn and win the game. So instead of trading pieces, the person who is down material should trade more pawns to reduce the opponent's chance of winning the game. Next, it's better for both sides to get their kings out during the endgame. In the endgame, there's not many pieces to attack the king, so the king is usually safe even if it's outside its castle position. So if you look at this position, black's king here is much more active than white's king. Black's king is already in the center, while white's king is still stuck where he used to be when he was castled. In this position, no matter who it is to play, black will win. In fact, even if it's white to play, the computer here gives black up almost 13 points in material. In general, the king is worth about 4 points in the endgame, so you should definitely activate the king to use it in your position. In addition, material is also important in the endgame. However, initiative is just as important. In this position, you can see that white's pieces are not mobile at all. Both rooks are stuck in the corner here, and this rook is guarding this pawn while this rook is trapped on the a1 square. In fact here, since black's rooks are so much more active than white's, he can eventually win a pawn very quickly with something like rook to c2 and attacking f2 and the pawns on the queen side. So in this case, white's lack of initiative and lack of active pieces actually will cause him to lose material here. Since there's not many pieces in the endgame, it's especially important for all the pieces that you have to be as active as possible. Sometimes players might even sacrifice material in order to get their pieces more active. For example here, white might need to realize that these pawns are not savable and instead use his moves right now to get his pieces to a better position. Now there's another interesting idea in the endgame that usually happens in the middle game as well, but more likely in the endgame. The idea here is Zugzwang. So if you remember from the tactics section, Zugzwang occurs when one side needs to make a move, but would rather not make a move. So in this case, if you look at this position, if it's white to move, if white plays king to d4, he actually loses the game because after king to f3, white manages to lose this pawn since his king is forced to move. However, here if white plays the correct move of king to d5, then white is able to win this pawn, even though the game will end up being a draw. However, if black plays the move king f3 here, then black gets into Zugzwang because his only piece that can move is the king, and if the king moves, black will be forced to give up the pawn on e4, leading to a draw leading to white winning eventually. Zugzwang happens more frequently in the endgame because there's fewer pieces to move, and it's easier to force the piece that you want to move to move. In addition, passed pawns must be pushed in the endgame. When you push your passed pawn in the endgame, it's close to promotion, so inevitably the opponent needs to give a piece to stop the promotion. So here, if we look at the two black pawns here, they're way closer to the promotion squares than white's pawns. Therefore, they actually create much more of a threat, and white's rook's already tied down. In addition, he's actually going to promote his pawn in 2 moves, so white has quite a big problem here, and black is going to win this game. Therefore, if you have a passed pawn in the endgame, push it if possible. But that doesn't mean if you push it too far, you'll lose it, right? So make sure you push it as far as you can without losing your pawn, and that will help restrict the opponent's space and his mobility. Finally, pawn structure is very important in the endgame. So I know this is a little bit of a stupid example, since white has 3 pawns in a nice pawn chain, and black has probably the worst pawn structure possible with 3 pawns, 3 triple pawns. However, in this case, you can definitely show how the pawn structure matters. Here, white has all 3 passed pawns ready to push against black's rook. However, black here really essentially only has 1 passed pawn on the b file, and will have a hard time putting pressure on white's rook. White's passed pawns will crash forward much quicker than black's passed pawns, and white should end up being able to win this game. So even though this kind of pawn structure might not happen in your game, it might not be this extreme, but a better pawn structure definitely gives one side a better chance to win in the endgame, especially since pawns are so important. So now I think we've covered most of the important principles in the endgame, and we're ready to dive into some real examples.